Hi, welcome to the monthly Gospel Advancing webinar series. My name is Tony, and today I have with us Wes Jones. He is the local youth pastor here with us in Colorado. Today's topic that we want to talk to you about is how to develop a Gospel Advancing student leadership team. Before we jump into today's content, I wanted to ask a question to you guys and my friend Wes here. First off, in the chat, will you put where are you from? And will you add what is one boring fact about yourself? So oftentimes we hear what is the most interesting thing about you? We don't care about that today. We want to know
Interesting.
what makes you average, what makes you boring.
Okay. Well, where am I from? My name's Wes. I am from Colorado. I live in Westminster, which is a northwest suburb of Denver. One boring fact about me. Um, I don't know. Maybe it's that I started balding when I was in high school. I don't know if that's boring or not or interesting, but um, eh, for some people it's boring. I guess I don't know.
It's just sad.
I
I'm
guess it is
sorry.
kind of sad. Yeah.
But yeah, so type in what is your boring thing. We care about that because it is the normal things in life that make us human, and so we care about what makes you a human as well. So in addition to today's training content, at the end we will have a time for question and answers with the speaker, Ben Phillips, and with Wes. They're going to answer a lot of questions for us. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, and we would love to answer them at the end of the training content. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have you with us. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Ben for today's training.
Thanks so much, Tony. So excited to have everybody on with us today and joining us from all over the place. I can't wait to get to go through and read some of your boring facts about yourself. I'm actually super excited about boring facts. That'll be very fun to hear. And Wes, that was interesting. I was more interested than bored, but then I got bored really quick with it. So I think it kind of fits well with it. So that's good. That's good. Hey, today we're talking about student leadership and how do we not just have like regular student leadership, but the idea of a gospel advancing student leader team. And it's taking something that's kind of a common model. And actually, we see the model of students being led into leadership around the world in so many different contexts. But within the church, the idea of student leaders, these young people that are rising up to lead amongst their peers to set the pace and to do it for us in a gospel advancing way. We talk about a lot gospel advancing leaders being one who shares Jesus personally and mobilizes teens to do the same. The amazing thing about that definition is it doesn't give us an age that somebody has to be at to be a gospel advancing leader. And the truth is, many of you have students within your ministry that fit that. They are sharing Jesus personally and mobilizing their peers, other teens, to do the same. And so we want to talk about how do we kind of work on that in maybe a little bit more of a formal way of working with students to develop and create student leader programs that are gospel advancing. And so just going to go through kind of a model that we're going to look at following the way that Jesus worked with things. But I want to start by kind of asking the question of when we're talking about students and students growing into leaders and really the development and discipleship of a student within our ministry, what do we actually want to see happen there? Like, what does the end goal look like for that? And to kind of find that, let's go into scripture here. We're going to look at Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 12 here. And so I want to read this to you, and then we're going to kind of break it down a little bit. So here's what it says. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people with the works of service, so that the whole body may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So in this passage, we see the desire that we have for our churches. I don't know if you saw it for yourself, but for me in youth ministry and working with adults in ministry, I always had this desire to see them growing in this unity in their faith and their knowledge of Christ and their maturity, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. These are big goals that we have. And this is what we want to see happen with our students, is that they would mature and grow into true followers, disciples of Christ who make disciples. And this is what it looks like. And that was the goals that I had. But here's the question. Did you see how that happens in this passage? Because it gave us that answer actually really clearly. It actually is verses 11 and 12. So it's this beginning piece. Christ gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers not to do the work of the ministry, but to equip his people for the work of the ministry. You see, a lot of times our model of ministry today is the idea that if I'm in that role of pastor or leader, it's my job to do the ministry. But Christ says, no, I've lifted you up, I've raised you up, and I have gifted you and equipped you and placed you in that position as a gift to the church to raise up the saints for the work of the ministry. So our job in this role is not that we look at it as, okay, how do I accomplish this? But how do I raise others up to accomplish the mission alongside me? And that needs to be our attitude in this. And when it comes to student leadership, we start right there. So the question becomes, how do we best set up our ministry to produce these kinds of disciples? We can do the typical youth ministry program, have that game or a Bible study, a lesson, sermon, whatever you want to call it. Maybe have some worship, have small groups if you have time for that, or whatever your typical structure is. We can even have a program that's filled with gospel advancing values and spend time in intercessory prayer, making sure that our students are trained in relational evangelism. But here is a reality that we all have to grasp. Our current program is perfectly designed to produce the results that it's getting. Your current youth ministry program is designed perfectly to produce the results that it's getting. If you're looking at the results and going, I got students coming out of this again and again and again that are just not at the level that I feel they should be at, that's what our programs are set up to produce, is what level you see them at. And so we need to be thinking about that in our programming. How do we develop this in a way? How do we strategize and brainstorm a little bit different method or model for how to develop these kind of disciples, that they would truly be equipped for the work of the ministry, to be raised up for this? And I have to challenge you on this, because a lot of times people say, well, people coming out of my ministry are ready for ministry, ready to serve in this. But the question is this, is if they have not served in the ministry, in your ministry, how are they ready to serve it out of your ministry? Are they ready to serve within your walls of your church, of your youth room? Or is it only when they've fully graduated out that they could probably help and serve somewhere else? I want to challenge you to think about this, because student leadership is this kind of program opportunity. It's the opportunity for students to get their hands on with the ministry, to actually be part of doing the work of it. It's this idea of a supplement to your ministry programming. It's not a replacement of it. It's a program within your program that's designed to equip students for the work of the ministry. So I want you to think about this, because biblically, you may look and say, well, there's not student leaders in scripture. And that's honestly, it's just wrong. The truth is there's actually a lot of examples of young people being raised up, trained up, and sent out on this mission to carry things out. Even one of the best examples that we have is Jesus working with his disciples. I want you to picture the disciples as a student leadership team. If you didn't know this, based upon what we see in scripture, it's likely that most of the disciples were actually teenagers. I think about in Matthew 17:27, where we've got this moment where Jesus and his disciples are going to enter into the temple, but they don't have, Peter says, we don't have the money to pay the tax. So Jesus sends them to the shore. He casts out, catches a fish, opens it up, and he finds a half shekel. He finds a full shekel within this fish's mouth. And here, if you go to Exodus 30, you see that the requirement for an adult to enter the temple, the tax that must be paid, was a half shekel. So he finds enough for 2 adults to pay the tax to enter. And it says they paid the tax and they all entered. What I think is strange about this moment is that we've got Jesus and his 12 followers with him, but we see only Jesus and Peter paying this tax, and then they all enter. See, the requirement was those that were 18 and older must pay this tax to enter into the temple. So now we've got this whole group that didn't have to pay the tax. So either they're breaking the law to enter the temple, or they're not old enough to have to pay the tax. That's such an interesting thing. Here's another fact. Most of them, that we don't see that they were married. Could they have been? Absolutely. But we only see one of the disciples mentioned as being married, and that's Peter. Now, according to their Jewish customs, at the age of 18, they would have already had this pairing, at least some kind of betrothal that was going on for marriage that would have been there. This is just part of their culture. And so for them to not be married likely means that they were younger than that age that would have happened at. Look at how Jesus interacted with them. He had to call them out on their arguing. He would explain things to them and they didn't understand it for a long time. That sounds like teenagers to me. I don't know about you, but that's what I dealt with. I felt like a lot of times with teenagers. Lovingly, I love them, but they don't always get it right away. Jesus, he referred to them as children, as little ones in Luke 10 and John 13, and again in John 21. This is how he refers to them. Let's look. That's how Jesus interacted with them. Look at the disciples' actions and interactions with each other. They'd argue about who would be the greatest among them. Now, I don't know if you're looking at it saying that doesn't mean anything, but if you took two middle school boys, two 7th or 8th grade boys out to a basketball court right now, and you were playing with them and then asked them which one is better, you would see this kind of argument break out. Which one is the greatest? Which one's the GOAT amongst them? You would start hearing their arguments, and even if they're missing every shot they take, they're going to argue about who is better. It's a constant thing. I actually got to witness this. I went and spoke at a youth ministry not long ago and got to see these two middle school boys that did not make a shot the entire open gym time. It's 30 minutes of shot after shot being missed, and they were arguing about who was better. And it was hilarious to me to constantly picture the disciples having this kind of a battle of these arguments going on. Jesus asked them to pray and they fell asleep. I've had students literally go through this. It's like, hey, we're going to spend some time in prayer. And I'm constantly having to wake them up. James and John, I love this one. When they're having this kind of feeling, they want to sit at Jesus's right and left hand when he enters his kingdom. They want these seats of honor, these positions of honor. But instead of talking to Jesus themselves, who do they send? Well, they send their mom. I don't know about you, but I had the students at times that would show up to go on a trip and their mom's coming in with them with that permission slip saying, I know that we didn't turn this in on time, but they are going with you. And the kid can't talk to me about it, but the mom is there to handle it. And I think about this, like these guys they're clearly, to me, they're teenagers. And there's even more evidence than this. Of just them being young. But I want you to think about that. If Jesus is working with teenagers, we've got Jesus, the first youth pastor, with one adult volunteer, Peter, who gets frustrated all the time and is quick to pull out a sword. And then you've got these 11 students with him, one of them who eventually betrays him. Got to be a middle schooler, right? I mean, this is the thing, though, as we look at this and these guys being teenagers changes how we see Jesus interacting with them. And we get to look at the model that Jesus had as a model for student leadership. He used what we call a crawl, walk, run model with them. And so what we see is Jesus starting with this first call that he has to them. And you see Philip in John 1:43. Jesus looks at him, he says, follow me. It was this word akalutheo. It means align yourself with me, accompany me, and assist me. And it's the same. This is that crawl, walk, run piece that's there. So the follow me piece that he says, you see them at the wedding at Cana where Jesus turns water into wine. And he invited his disciples to go with him. This is the crawl. I want you to just come and see what it's like and watch and see what I'm doing, how I'm interacting with people. I'm going to invite you into my life to be part of these things. And we're going to start walking in this way and beginning the process of doing some ministry work together. But mostly you're going to learn by watching me. Then we see in John 3 and John 4, Jesus takes his disciples to go and baptize in the Judean countryside. This is the accompany side of it, where you're going to walk with me, where they actually get their hands wet. They're actually in the water. It says that the disciples were the ones baptizing. Jesus himself was not in the water baptizing, but teaching and sending people ready to be baptized into the water. And his disciples were doing that. It brings up a question to me of going, if I had a teenager who's discipling his friend who's ready to be baptized, why can't that teenager be the one who baptizes him? Because if I see the disciples who by every standard were not qualified according to what we would say they need to be to baptize them, then why can't a teenager today baptize? Why do we put these levels of authority on it instead of just understanding what it's about? And so there's just interesting things that I see with this of Jesus saying, let me walk with you in this. And then he sends them out to do the ministry. In Luke 9 and 10, we see him sending out the 12 and the 72. We see the book of Acts. It's this idea of they've learned to crawl with him, kind of watching him do it. They've assisted him. They've walked with him in it. Now he's stepping back and allowing them to run in this, to actually go with him in this, and even gets out of the way and says, I'm leaving and setting you to run with the ministry. So with this, it's the idea of that crawl, walk, run. And I want to ask you a question. A poll here is going to pop up on your screen. Where do you feel your current or potential student leaders are at on this scale? Where do you feel like your discipleship with them is at? Are you at the mode where they just need to start kind of learning how to crawl, to see what it's like to do the ministry, to just show up with you and go through some of the processes of it, to see that side of it, to go with you as you're discipling one of their peers, or working with somebody that's allowed them to come in and be able to see this? Kind of like when you go to the hospital at times and they bring in students that are learning, but they get to come in and learn with the doctor what's going on. Maybe you need that with some of your students, or maybe they're at this point of this kind of walk thing where it's ready to hand them off some stuff and you can do ministry together. Or maybe you're in the point where you're going, I can hand them a full night of ministry and I can step back and let them run with it and they can handle these things. But I'd love to answer that in the poll there. Where do you feel your student leaders or potential student leaders are at right now on that scale? So I want to break this down, just kind of a program or a model of student leadership in a way that makes it a little easier for us to structure one out here. So I'm going to give you this, breaking it down into some specific sections here. The first one is this. It's the idea of vision. It's answering this question: what does the accomplished vision look like? When we're talking about your youth ministry, but I think about just Jesus with his disciples. What was the accomplished mission? What would that look like? Did he ever state that? Well, actually in Matthew 24:14, he gives us this answer. He says this: and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. It's this great moment of him saying, here, I'm sending you on this mission, and to accomplish it, the gospel needs to be carried out to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. This is the accomplished vision of what he has cast for them to step out in. So I want you to think about this. What is the vision or mission of your youth ministry? You know, this question we gotta answer first is, do we have a bold vision that's God honoring, that's God sized, meaning he has to show up to accomplish it? What is it that we're about and trying to accomplish in this? And then how do you see a student leader team actually helping with that? How do they further that vision or accomplish that mission? These are the kind of questions that we ask when we're thinking about that vision area and structuring out a student leadership program within that vision. Is how could this actually add to it? The next section that we get into is the idea of need. Does our bold vision require more workers to accomplish it? I'm just going to tell you this, that if it only requires you to accomplish it, it's not a very bold vision. In fact, it's probably not a bold vision at all. And so when we're thinking about bold visions, which in gospel advancing, this is it. God gives us bold vision to carry the gospel to every teen everywhere, every teen in your community, every teen in your cause turf. And so thinking about this, it's going to go beyond you. So this question of need is right now where your youth ministry is at. Is there a true need for this? In John 3:17, we see the mission of Jesus laid out. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And then Jesus himself states again in Luke 19:10, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. He's proclaiming a huge mission. A mission that, as you know, we go back and look through the life of Jesus, we don't see him fully accomplish seeking and saving all of the lost. We don't see him coming in to accomplish or fulfill the whole thing, where he does all the work that's needed for people to be saved and then sends us out to finish this work of bringing people into salvation through the message of the gospel. And so we see that this bold vision that he had for the whole world to hear, he set this vision up that goes beyond him, which is crazy. It's beyond him, but also through him and with him, and he's in all of it. So it's not beyond him and yet beyond him. Blows my mind. We can talk about that in another webinar sometime. But at the same time, I love how he lays this out clearly there. And so I want you to think about this for your ministry. What is the need? Is there a need for more helpers in that harvest field right now? How do you see student leaders benefiting your ministry, adding benefit to it? Are you willing? Here's a really good question. Are you willing to change the things that you do or the way that you do things in order to give student leaders a position in that? Because you're going to have to change things if you're going to add more workers to it. Are you willing to take your hands off and to trust students to carry the ministry? Do you have handles built around your ministry, ways that they can grab hold of it and help carry it? And are you willing to take your hands off those and let student leaders take those roles? Is there a need for that formal team yet? Or would it be better for you to kind of pour into one or two students and raise them up for the future? Maybe it's looking at it this year saying, I'm just going to deeply disciple a couple of students that are standouts and start leading them into the idea of being student leaders in these next years or the next semester. So start asking those kind of questions of need. The next section I want to look at is the idea of standards. What standards do we have? Like, who should be a part of the student leadership team and who shouldn't be? And before you answer that question right now, I want you to go back. Let's look at how Jesus selected his and see who he selected. Luke 6:13-16 says this: when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who is called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. I'm going to repeat that list for you in just a new way here. Here's who Jesus chose. He chose a denier. He chose fishermen. He chose a tax collecting traitor to his people. He chose a doubter, a zealot, and a thieving backstabber. This is the best student leader team of all time, right? That's exactly what we want to have. I don't think any of us would select those students, and yet Jesus did. What are we thinking about with this? I think about student leaders for me that I looked at, and it was students that I was going, there's no way that this would be a student leader. And yet it always seemed to be that the ones that I was like, there's no way, God was going, hey, I choose and use the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And so it's so often like this. And I love that we see Jesus laying this out. So before we set standards that would exclude these students, we need to set standards that allow students to step up into them. All right. And so think about the rules that you have. Think about these standards that you're going to set and give to them. Think about, are you going to have grace in the midst of those failings? Like when they fall short of it, do you have some grace for them? And how are you going to work this out? Or is it something like there's certain standards that need to be very solid and hard and others that you're going to have some grace in? Prioritize your students over the program. That's a big thing that we need to remember, is that we can't just look at this and say our program matters more than the student. And so if a student gets run over in the midst of it because they're just not living up to these things, then they just need to get out of the way. That's just how it works. We can't live ministry and do ministry that way. We need to care about the students where they're at and bring them alongside. It's discipleship is what you're doing, just in a formalized setting of student leadership. I want you to remember what it was like for you as a teenager. It's not always easy to step into leadership. In fact, it never is easy to step into leadership. It puts a target on you, and it makes it difficult, especially if you're going to stand up in front of your peers. And so think about these ways. So here's the questions for you to be thinking about. What standards do you feel are needed for your student leaders? What are some of the things that you look at your own programming and go, this is going to have to happen? Are you expecting them to live up to the same standards as you? In your position as the leader or a leader within the ministry, are you setting the same standards for yourself that you do for these students, or is there room for them to grow to those? And here's the next question is, are you living up to those standards? This is someone we always need to go back and ask ourselves. If I see, and I would only hire or bring in a student pastor or a leader at this level, am I living up to that level? Do I need to be growing myself and leading in this way so that student leaders have something to follow after as an example? So great challenge for us in that. The next piece that we see is the idea of a team or a structure. How would we structure them out? How do we send them out? Luke 9:1-2 here, it says, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them the power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And then in Luke 10:1, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. I love this example here of Jesus sending out the 12 there, because it gives us the example of what authority he gave them. And what's interesting is if you look at the ministry of Jesus up to this point, guess what he's been doing? Going from town to town, proclaiming the kingdom, casting out demons, healing the sick. He literally just sent them out with the same authority that he has. And then he sends out 72 other disciples to do the same thing and to lay the groundwork that he's been doing up to this point. It's an incredible thing to me, the authority that he gives them as he sends them out. So here's the question for you. What roles would you want your student leaders to serve hands-on in? What are the things that you're looking at and saying, I want to give them this role that gives them some authority, that they're able to represent our ministry in this area? Whether that maybe it's something like this. For the youth ministry that I was part of, we set up a welcome team that students were at the door welcoming every teen that came in, helping them get checked in, connecting with new parents. We had one girl named Lily who was kind of she was the head of our welcome team. After a while, she just wanted to do that every month. We rotated through different teams, but that was the one she wanted. And it came to the point that I could trust Lily. If a new parent came in and I saw Lily was talking with that parent and the student, I, as a youth pastor, didn't even need to go have the conversation, because I knew that she was so capable of this and could give them a tour of the building, could connect them with who they needed to. She had the authority to be that face of our ministry at the door there. And so think about these kind of areas and roles that they could play a role in, and then set those expectations for each team of what are the things they need to live up to. Back to our welcome team, their standard was this: they wanted every student who walked in there to know that they were loved, that they were cared for, and that they mattered. And so at the door, they wanted that feeling to come across in the way that they greeted them, the way that they cared for them. It wasn't, I want every student to make sure that we see every face, that we get every student checked in, and that we make sure that they answer all of our questions on the permission slip. That wasn't their standard. Those were substandard pieces that were important to us at times, but their focus, their vision for it was all tied into the gospel advancing focus that we had. Think of it this way: if you've got expectations for these teams, but you don't define them or you don't speak them out, those undefined expectations are unrealistic expectations. And this is where you get frustrated and your students will give up. Like, if you don't give them clarity in what it is that you're looking for, then they're not going to know what to chase after, and you're going to get frustrated. They're going to get frustrated, and they're just going to give up on it. So here's some questions to ask in the standards area. What teams or roles would be beneficial to your ministry? What are the areas that you're looking at saying, this could really help us grow in our ministry right now? These are weak areas that we need some strength built up in. What would those teams or roles equip the student leaders for the work of the ministry? Are you setting up student leaders to just take out the trash and reset the chairs? Or are you giving them roles? Not that that's not important, but are you giving them roles that they can serve in the ministry as well? In ways that it's like they're getting hands-on in this. Maybe it's letting them do the announcements at the beginning of group, welcoming everyone and doing the announcements of what's coming. Maybe you're letting them be the prayer team that leads things throughout the night of prayer. Maybe they're your team that's setting up all of your outreaches every month. You could set up a lead the cause team of student leaders that are looking at every month, setting up one outreach that all of your students could be involved in. Maybe they're the ones that you're allowing to lead worship, or maybe they're even ones that you're setting up to teach every once in a while in youth group or lead small groups, whatever it is. Think about these areas that allows them to grow and equips them for the work of the ministry. The next one, do you feel that you do a good job of defining roles for your leaders? Think about your adult leaders. Do you do a pretty good job of defining those roles? And here I'm going to challenge you. If they're with you, if you got one of those adult leaders with you, you're going to see one later. Get real and get humble and ask them. Do you just go to them and say, do you feel I do a good job of defining your role as a leader? I'll just tell you, I had one time where a leader messaged me after youth group and said, hey, we need to meet. And I was like, okay, that's fine. Where do we need to meet? Like, all of our leaders had been kind of weird that day. And I was going, what is happening? And so we met down at his business that he had. And it's just him and I in this kind of dark coffee shop. And he's sitting there. He goes, okay, so all of us leaders have been talking, and I'm going, here it is. This is it. And they felt like I had not defined their roles very clearly. And so they didn't know where we were at on stuff and what they needed to do. So we went back over some things. It was very helpful for me. In that moment, I wanted to defend myself, but I realized I got to eat some humble pie here. I need to hear, because my leaders they're voicing this to me, hoping that there can be change. They're not just dropping out and saying, yeah, I'm not with this guy. We're done. They were willing to voice this to me so that we could change things and make it better. And we were able to do that. And so ask that question. It's super helpful. It's humbling, but it's helpful to hear the answer of, are you doing a good job of defining those roles? Because if you're not doing it for your adult leaders, it's unlikely you're going to do that very well for your student leaders. So I just want to set that up for you. The last section I want to talk about is the idea of trouble. What do we do with our student leaders when there's trouble? What's the reaction to trouble? Do I have this idea of fight or flight, or this, which is what most of us go to when trouble comes up, conflict comes up, scandal comes up, whatever it is? We either want to get into this big defensive mode of fighting everything, or we just want to run away from it. We're like, we're just going to avoid this. We're done with it. We're giving up on this whole thing. We're tossing student leadership. Or no, we're going to act like that didn't happen and just not address it. Or there's another whole side of this that we can jump to. It's the idea of forgive and focus. Now, forgiving doesn't mean always giving back that immediate trust right away. Of saying you get this roll back or you're able to do it, because sometimes we get in situations that we can't just let someone right back in. They need to be restored into this. Focus them in for restoration. I think about what Jesus did with Peter. Peter, is the guy who's saying, Jesus, I would die for you. I will give up my life for you. No one's going to kill you. I will die right alongside you if they do. And Jesus goes, really, Peter? You'll do that? He says, yes, I'm in. I'm all in. I will do this. And Jesus goes, Peter, here's the thing. Before the rooster crows, before you hear this, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter's like, no, I would never do this. He is denying what would be his denial ahead of time. But we know the story. It comes to this point where he has this opportunity to stand and be known as one who follows Christ. And what does he do? He denies him again and again and again, even to children that are asking him. He denies it. He gets angry. He gets frustrated because he saw himself at risk. And so in this moment, we see Peter deny Jesus for the 3rd time. The rooster crows. Peter looks up and Jesus is making eye contact with him across the way. And think of that moment. For Peter, he felt like he had failed completely. It was done. This was a huge failure on Peter's front, and he left. He was done. We see Peter through the next several weeks have this struggle. Even after Jesus is resurrected at his crucifixion, we don't see Peter there. At his resurrection, we see Peter have this hesitancy to even be like, he runs, but he's also hesitant in what's going on. And we see these moments where Peter is just struggling to be part with the disciples. So he goes back to fishing again. We see Peter do this in his frustration. He goes back to his livelihood. He's got to support his family. He goes back to this job, invites the other disciples to join him. They're out on the boat all night long, catch nothing. Jesus comes walking on the shore. They don't know who he is. He's just a guy on the shore to them. And he calls out, hey, how was fishing last night? It's horrible. We didn't catch anything. He says, hey, why don't you cast your nets on the other side of your boat? Now, if you fished, you understand that's not really how that works. And for Peter, who's been fishing his whole life, he's going, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. But sure, why not? Let's throw the nets down the other side of the boat. Makes no sense. But Peter and the guys drop the nets on the other side, and they fill with so many fish that it's starting to tear the nets and cause the boat to seem like it's going to sink. Peter realizes that it's Jesus on the shore, throws off his outer cloak and dives into the water, swims with this urgency to the shore and gets there. And we don't see this moment where it says, and they embraced, and Peter just in tears was broken before Jesus. It almost is, it's kind of awkward standing there with no real interaction. And then Jesus is there cooking fish for them. And it's such an interesting thing. Peter helps pull the nets onto the shore. We go through this whole process of almost some awkwardness with Peter. And at one point, Jesus looks at him in John 21 and he says, Peter, walk with me. Let's go down the beach here. And they're walking and he asks him this question. He says, Peter, do you love me? Peter says, yes, I love you. Jesus asks, do you love me unconditionally? Peter says, I love you like a brother. Again and again and again, they go through this and Jesus gives him commands. And he says, Simon, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And then restores him in this moment. And I love this because Jesus then explains to Peter that he would honor him. You will die just as you committed. You will die one day for me, Peter, explaining how this would happen. And this is John 21:19. It says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him this, follow me. These words here, once again, are akalutheo. Peter, align yourself with me, accompany me, and assist me. He restores Peter and invites him back in to the role of being a follower of him, to come back into the fold of it. So I think about the scandal and trouble that can hit your youth group, your student leader team. Maybe you have a student who falls into sin and it's publicly exposed. I went through that with students and had to deal with those things on weekend retreats where I've got all my students together and things blow up. And the student that I had leading so much, I now have to remove from that position, but care for them along the way and work with them to be restored, not to the position of student leader, but restored in their relationship with God as the focus. If there's an opportunity as they continue to grow, that they're able to step back in forgiveness to this role of student leader again, that's just incredible work of God in the discipleship process through that. We need to see the discipleship process within working with students that have gone through these kind of things, that have fallen into it. Do we just kick them out, or do we work with them to help them grow and follow the example of Jesus to get them to the point that we can invite them back in? So questions of things that can come up with your student leaders is stuff like this. How do you avoid cliques? How do you avoid your student leaders not just closing off from everybody else and doing their own thing? How do you avoid scandals? How do you set your ministry up in a way that it's not going to be destroyed by a scandal like that, like having a student leader's sin exposed publicly, and your student ministry is not just going to fall apart? How do we set this up in the right way? How do you respond to scandal when it comes up? Are you fight or flight where you kick them out? Or are you the one who comes in and says, I'm going to work with you, we're going to focus in, and we're going to work on forgiveness and growing in these things? What about when a student leader doesn't live up to the role that they agreed to step into? What is your response to that in these things where they're just not living up to that role? For us, we set a standard that was our step up or step down principle, where if we saw a student leader that wasn't living up to these things, we'd come to them and say, hey, this month I need to see you step up. If they chose over that month to not step up in the areas that we challenged them, then they were asked to step down. They were continuing in discipleship with an adult leader after that, so that hopefully they can be restored and grown in it. But it gave them the challenge of, hey, I need you to step up in this area, these specific areas I'm not seeing you step up in, or I'm going to have to ask you to step out of this position because you're representing the ministry, you're representing Christ, and you're not doing it to the level that we need to glorify God. So it's good to have these kind of questions. How could you set your ministry up to survive this kind of trouble, to survive a scandal, or to survive student leaders breaking off into cliques, and to restore this back to what it needs to be? So here's a question, a poll that we're going to kind of wrap up this time with. What area do you need to focus on most with this? Do you need to focus on the vision and just establishing a God-given bold vision? What is this that God has called us to do, and what's our ministry about? Do you need to focus on the need for your ministry? Is there a need for student leadership? The standards that you would set? Maybe the structure and the roles that you would give them, or setting yourself up to be ready to deal with trouble. Out of these 5 areas, which one do you need to focus in on the most? Take a second here and answer that in the poll. I want to wrap up this time here clearly by just giving you an opportunity of something. You may be looking and saying, how do I kind of launch student leaders, or even identify student leaders, or maybe train them in a deeper way when it comes to gospel advancing values? Here's something I would give you is in November 11th of this year, we've got an event going on called Dare to Share Live that is happening globally all over the world for students and leaders to get trained and equipped in the gospel and how to carry this out, and then to actually go out into their communities and do this. Again, this is going to be happening all over the world. We have sites signed up literally around the globe right now that are ready to join us on that day to go out and do this wave of youth evangelism that's going to go around the world, and hopefully continue in momentum that'll just keep going and going and going. So there's going to be a ton of information about that's available to you. You can jump onto daretosharelive.org to register your group today. And I would just encourage you to jump on to do that right now. It's a great way to train up your student leaders to be ready to lead the cause within your group, to join with Jesus on the mission, to become disciples who follow him and carry the gospel out to their friends. So as we transition to our Q&A time, I'm going to give you a second to jump onto daretosharelive.org and to register your group right now.
Thank you, Ben, for sharing with us this morning. I'm just excited to kind of jump into some of the questions that we've had from some of you guys, and to kind of shine some light onto why we answered the polls the way we did. So first, we'll jump into the first poll. I'll just throw this straight to you, Ben. The first poll was, rate your current / potential student leaderships on this scale: crawl, walk, run. We had run was the smallest, but could you just give some insight to why you think the kind of attendees responded the way they did?
I think it's probably pretty common across our students that if we were looking at like student leaders, many of the student leaders that I brought on, or if it was a new program that we had, this is where they were at, was kind of that crawl section where it's like, hey, I'm going to show you the basics of what it is to walk in ministry here. And we're going to learn to just slowly move. I want you to watch and just come alongside me in this, and I'll help you to learn in these areas. And so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they're at that point. What I love is that people were able to answer that question, because that means that they are thinking, okay, which students would they be? And I can evaluate a little bit of where they're at. Now, I think that this kind of crawl to walk, you're seeing this is reflective of us in youth ministry on what our discipleship model really is and where we're at in it. Because if we're looking at it, many of us, if we looked at the ministry of Jesus, would probably be sitting in that crawl section as well, even as leaders. A lot of times, I think that we're not quite at the level that we should be at, and we need to be constantly growing and discipled and being disciples. And so, in that, then our students often kind of raise up to the level that we're at. They don't surpass the teacher, but become like their teacher, is what Jesus said. And so I'm not saying that you're at that crawl level. That's not what I'm saying for sure. But I am saying that we need to challenge ourselves on that, of seeing if that's where I'm at, that's where my students are going to be at. And I'm not going to see them surpass me in this very often. And so I would just challenge you to think about personally where you're at in that, but then also think about what you've been doing to disciple those students. And if they've been a student leader for a long time and they're still at this crawl point, maybe they're either not ready to be a student leader or your program needs adjusted. But Wes, what do you think about kind of why we would see that kind of that answer across there?
I think it takes time. I've been leading student leader teams for a while now. And I actually, if I were to answer that question, I'd say most of my student leaders are probably in the walk phase. But I have them in all phases right now. I just graduated 3 student leaders who I felt were in the run phase. Like I could trust them with anything and everything. I could completely hands off. I just graduated 3 of them. And so one of the ways that I've been working with that is I had them help train and equip some of our upcoming leaders who, when they joined, were probably in that crawl phase. But now as we head into this new school year and our graduating seniors that were on my team are gone, they're walking. And so I think it just takes time as you progress students through the student leadership team and over the years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And and I think one thing that helps progress students is having leaders in front of them that are not the adults, that are showing them what it is like to be running, to be walking and moving towards that.
Absolutely.
One question that came in when we were talking was, do you guys have any recommendations for structuring your student leadership meetings? I know, I'll throw it to Wes since you're practically doing it right now. What does that kind of look like for you? Do you have any thoughts, or how do you structure it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I have wrestled with and changed every year, really. And it's to help our team grow together. So as I look about this last year, I tried something new, and I tried doing our leader team meetings with our adults and our student leaders together the whole time. For years, I had done them separate, and I wanted to try it together to create cohesion amongst our team. And there were positives from that, and there were negatives from that. And this year I'm deciding to split it again. But the way I structure my meetings is the first part is prayer. If we believe that prayer fuels our ministry, we simply spend the first 15 minutes of our ministry in prayer. The second portion is the way our ministry model runs, my presence on stage in all of our activities and all of our programming is very minimal. And so I have our student leaders, they lead our worship, they lead our prayer time, they lead our pause for the cause time, they lead our small group time, they lead our commissioning prayer at the end. And so and sometimes they lead our teaching. I primarily am only on stage for teaching. So during our meetings, we spend 30 to 40 minutes having them be assigned roles for what they'll do. And then they take the time to plan out the roles. So what are we going to do for pause for the cause this month? What method of prayer are we going to choose for our intercessory prayer time? And so they assign themselves and the adult leaders their roles, and then they plan it out. After that, I do a 30-minute training time. I have found that when you ask students, and typically your leaders that you have in your youth ministry are very busy people. So I have found that trying to assign them homework outside of ministry can be challenging, especially if it involves reading. So we are working through 4-Chair Discipling right now, a great book for anybody who is looking on the process of discipling students. We read a chapter together each meeting, and then we discuss it. I do have them, because students love technology, I do have them watch a 10-minute training video on their own, and we also discuss that. So there's a training portion of my meeting, there's a prayer portion of my meeting, there's a planning portion of my meeting, and then I have like 20 minutes of flex time. So that maybe is looking to the future. Like if we have an upcoming retreat, I say, okay, who wants to lead this, or what roles do you want to have? It's a visioneering time. It's a calendaring time. So that's kind of my meeting's about 2 hours long, and once a month at first Sunday of every month is how I structured. I don't know if you have anything.
No,
to add
that's
to that.
awesome. That's dead on. I have nothing to add to that. That's so good.
Yeah. One of my favorite things you said in that at the very beginning was that it changes and it adapts over time, just because, you know, the students that you have might look different. The size of your group might be different. And so just being willing to change it when needed. There was a question that kind of came in, and kind of to paraphrase this, I'll pass this over to you, Ben, but it basically is talking about like, hey, I have a smaller youth ministry. Why? I don't necessarily see a logistical need to have a student leadership team. What are the things that I can do to start implementing stuff, even if I don't have a big need for it at this moment in time?
Oh, absolutely. You know, this question, it's actually such a good question. When you're looking at a smaller ministry that you're going, I don't really need this super big structure of a team. That goes to that last question that we went through in the needs section, which is maybe I just need to be discipling a couple of those students to set them up for the work of the ministry. And the truth is, I know I've got a lot of friends running youth ministries that are like 5 to 7 kids. I know a few that it's like 2 or 3 kids even. And the beauty of that is they have the opportunity to disciple them on a deeper level. And so that's what I would focus on is student leadership is just about us discipling them. We just make it formal to fit within the programming of what we're doing so that we can do this, honestly, because most of us, we don't have the time in the midst of everything else to not make it programmed. And so it gives you this opportunity within the smaller group setting to disciple students in a deeper way, to help raise them up so that they're ready to lead. We always have to remember the average youth ministry around the world is 10 kids. And that's average. And so that means we got a lot below that. We got a lot above that, and many that are right at that level. And so some people would look and say, well, that's a small youth ministry, but 10 kids is average. It's not small. And so that's just looking at it. Jesus stopped at 12, and one of those didn't work out. So think about it, like discipling them in a deep way. Think about the potential and purpose that you have with it. What I saw my student leader group as, which we would take about 15 to 17 student leaders every year is what we'd have in our group. And we had a large group, but with these student leaders, that became like a youth group within our youth group. Those were the students that I discipled heavily. And my wife and I would pour into them. And so that's what I love about that small group model is it gives me the opportunity to just have that with students. And so we got to have that in different settings and different places that we served. And there's the same principles apply of what you can do and getting them involved, maybe not on a Wednesday night in your youth meeting, but maybe you can give them some roles on a Sunday morning that they can serve within the church and be part on that, or some other programming that you do throughout the year, an event, a VBS, something like that, where they can have roles that they get to actually do the work of the ministry that you've equipped them for. So that's what I would look at with those.
Yeah, I think just putting in my 2 cents about it is like the smaller the group, the easier it is to implement at the same time, because you get to have them come alongside with you doing things and getting to empower them to do things. Wes, just to go back to the question before about the structuring your student leadership, would you mind just stating the process or the stages that you do again? We just had it come up in the chat that people wanted to take notes on it.
Yes.
Because they like what you had to say.
So may I clarify? Process of the meeting or like process of how I get student leaders on my team?
I think the leadership format, like of the meeting itself.
Of the meeting itself. Yeah. So I first thing, I start with prayer, 10 to 15 minutes. Now, this is in a scope of a 2-hour time frame. After prayer, I do planning. This is where student leaders are assigned roles, and they also assign my adult leaders roles of what they'll be doing within the youth group. If you're looking for ways in which your student leaders can be involved and lead in the youth group, I encourage you, if you're at a point like I will say this, it has taken me time to be very hands-off when it comes to being upfront, but allow them to lead intercessory prayer time. What does that look like? Allow them to lead your pause for the cause, or some people call it take 5 time within your youth group. Allow them to lead small groups. This has taken a lot of time and it will take a lot of training to help them lead small groups well. Allow them to lead commissioning prayer time. Allow them to lead game time. Like that was hard for me because if you know me, I love games. And to be hands off with that and to let them lead it was really hard. But also, it's also one of the things that they can do really well. And I just get to enjoy the game. that they choose to play. So we do 15 minutes prayer, 30 to 40 minutes planning. After that, we do probably 45 minutes worth of training, one that is collectively trained on together through a book, and then one that is a discussion based on a video that they have watched. Whether sometimes that's like apologetics. It's to help equip them in their faith or to help them disciple other students well. We go through different video training series throughout the year. The platforms I use are Right Now Media or Youth Ministry University that provide training videos. After that, we do like 20 minutes of flex time where I can throw in anything really that we need to talk about as a team. And so that's the basic structure of a meeting. I do it the first Sunday of every month prior to our Sunday morning service.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. And so I hope you got that. I saw someone putting it in the chat, so follow along for that. Ben, I have a question specifically for you, and it is, Ben, do you have a student leadership application form that you use? And then could you share it with me if you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the deal. I don't have it available to throw out into the chat right now, but I will put it in the Gospel Advancing Ministry Facebook group, just as a resource that goes along with this so that you can look through that. But I'll just give you the basic packet of what we used. It has all of our interview pieces for potential student leaders. It has all the application stuff of what they filled out, forms that they signed, that their parents signed, what they were agreeing to. Even we did an adult reference form that had to be an adult outside of their family, someone they weren't related to. So many of our students are having to go to a teacher at school and get this teacher to reference them coming in. And then they had an interview process with us. We made it formal. I had students that come in. I'm a very laid back person, and I'd have students come in just with tears because they've never been in an interview. And I'm going, well, this is a great place to start, sitting on a couch in my living room, eating a donut with tears. So, but I'll just tell you, like, the formality of that helped them to see, hey, this is the fact that I'm going through this process. It made them see the weight of what we were doing. And so I've got that side. Even within there, we have a whole page that you can see the structure of all the different teams that we had, and then events and stuff that we did throughout the year that they were required to be part of, some of the different stuff that they were allowed to do and now didn't have to do throughout the year, but just sets the standards for them. So I'll put that into our Gospel Advancing Facebook group. If you're not part of that, jump on and join us here now. So
yeah, you heard it here first. So I want to answer the last poll question that we put up, and it was, what do you need to focus on the most? And so we went through the 5 things that Ben talked through. Obviously, trouble was the least one that we wanted to talk about, because I feel like you have to get through those 4 stages before trouble really is an issue. But for you, Wes, which one of those things do you constantly still need to work on as you focus on youth ministry?
And it's so ironic. Literally, the one I would have answered was trouble. And I would have been the only one who answered that. As I look at them, I think standards. That's one I have constantly been that I constantly wrestle with and change is. I think about what are we holding our student leaders accountable? And my answer is a lot. They carry a heavy weight. Like when I think about what our students do and the requirements, maybe if they're on a sports team or theater or musical performance, like they're doing practice every day after school. Then they have their games, and they're required to be at them. And so my standards are pretty high. My ask is pretty high for my student leaders, and it's one I'm constantly revising. And Ben, you mentioned this when you were talking, is you have to have grace.
Yeah.
You have to have so much grace as you're working with students, because there will be times where they're just like, they're on fire and they're crushing. And there are other times you just sit there and you question, like, what are you doing? And so we're constantly revising standards and thinking about our team. And that's one that I am always working on to try to do it well and to honor our mission and our vision that we have within our youth ministry.
Yeah. Ben, which one did you find that you constantly needed to focus on?
Oh man. Well, I think it was different seasons for each of them. You know, our vision didn't change, but it was about casting and recasting the vision with our student leaders. And so we go through seasons where it's like, man, they're losing this. I could see the mission drift in what they were doing. And so we'd come back to that, reevaluating our need every year, going through with our adult leaders, with our leadership team of the church, and going, are we at a point where we need this, or do we need to restructure it? Structure was one for us that we constantly went back to, because it was like, how not only restructuring a meeting, but structuring their teams. What roles do they have? Do we need to develop new ones? Are there some of the roles we've been given that we need to take back and reestablish where they need to be? Trouble was one that I feel like from day one of youth ministry for me, we faced trouble. And so I feel like that was the first one that we established some things in, that it was like, I've got to be ready to handle this, because I've got students that are coming from messy backgrounds, unchurched homes, that don't know the unspoken Christian rules of what it is to be a Christian kid. You know, whether you believe in Jesus or not, there's these church kid rules that kids that don't go to church, they don't know. And I can't expect them to understand that. And so that was what we dealt with a lot, was kind of that standards and trouble that I felt like we were constantly having to go back and juggle through, because we let in kids that some people would have looked at and say, why are you letting that kid in? They shouldn't be part of your group, let alone a student leader. And yet we saw willingness and opportunity to disciple and growth, even in the midst of the messiness. And so I would do it again and again and again, but those were areas we had to focus on because of it.
Yeah, that's great. And I just one last question, and we're going to end. It came through from Jeremiah. He asked, do you have Bible studies on campus? And I'm going to add just a little Tony twist onto it, is how do you, or have you helped your students develop stuff so they can lead on their campuses?
I'm going to answer this real quick for a second. There's two things coming up in just a few months. Actually, one of these monthly webinars is going to be all about how to help your students engage their campus for ministry in some of these different ways. But along with our structure, and I know that Wes does this too with their student leaders, is there's Bible reading things that we want them to dive in and do. We had full plans for us that was like, throughout the year, these are the things our student leaders will read. We used the YouVersion app where we could keep track of who read that day, and everyone was required to answer a question for each of the days. Just the question at the end, they had to put some kind of comment in it. So we did it kind of like the online college Blackboard stuff, where you had to go in and like, you have to respond to 3 things and do this. We did that at first so that our student leaders were definitely involved in not just skimming through or hitting the next button, but actually reading it. And then we discussed those things. But with that, they were studying scripture personally. But then actually what we saw, we didn't establish those studies ourselves, but saw students catch the vision and establish the studies themselves quickly, because they saw an opportunity to lead at their school. We kept the campus as a mission field in front of them all the time. This idea of them thinking that way. We even had our students coming back from events like Lead the Cause, putting together strategic action plans for their school specifically, as we had 9 schools represented in our ministry. And so we had 9 different strategic plans that were all school focused. And so a lot of stuff developed out of that. But Wes, what have you guys done as far as just Bible studies on campus and those kind of things?
You know, this year I am super stoked what we're planning to do. It's something new. If you have heard of the 9-month mission trip, Travis Deans, he does a lot with it from the National Youth Worker Network. But anyway, he has like this cool template and booklet to help students realize that their school is their mission field. And so this year in youth group, each kid will have a booklet. We've kind of rehashed it a little bit for our own group, but it'll have weekly goals for them to set while they're on campus. And maybe that goal for them is to bring their Bible and read it once during the school week. I know that we have some students that actually came into the youth room on Monday because they started school today, and they sat down together and said, we'd like to do a lunch, a weekly Bible study at lunch. How is this going to look? So those 2 of my students, one who's going into high school, were like, I want to start this right from the get-go. And that was really cool to see. But for each student, maybe to identify where they're at in their own faith journey and what would be an appropriate goal for them within their campus. That's good. That's the goal this year. And we'll have a weekly time within our youth group, like 5 minutes for them to just simply think about their goal and what they want to do this week on their campus to keep their school a mission field.
So good.
That's so good. And just to remind you guys, that was the 9-month mission trip that Travis Deans helps with the National Youth Leader Network.
National Network of Youth Leaders.
So many words. Am I right? But that is our time that we have with you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to sign up or get signed up for our next monthly webinar. It's going to be the topic of how to get your students praying. And so that'll be on September 5th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time.